Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and on this Friday evening, I'm joined by Kieran Andrieu. Kieran, how are you doing?
Michael, I have to say, I invariably find these introductions the most awkward part of my whole night whenever I come on Novara Live. I've been told I'm too jittery and fast of delivery, so I'm going to try and slow it down a little bit. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me back.
I thought the tempo there was fantastic. I feel at ease. I feel interested in what you might say next. So, real high score there. Coming up, a second interview with Tayyip Ali on Netanyahu's arrest warrant. We're going to be speaking especially about the response from our own government and governments around the world. Keir Starmer has caused quite the furore on Twitter by sharing a picture of him cozying up with BlackRock. Now, there are many reasons for left-wingers to be worried about this. BlackRock very much associated with privatization and the privatization of infrastructure. Interestingly, though, this has really been picked up on by the right. It's right-wingers who are absolutely furious that Keir Starmer has sat down with BlackRock. They're an asset management firm, by the way. So you'll find out why later in the show. And we'll talk about John Prescott and whether sort of any politicians can... I mean, we're going to show you a clip of him standing up to Jeremy Clarkson, basically, and discuss whether anyone has quite the gumption to do that now, or if he's a politician from a bygone age. The ICC issuing an arrest warrant against Benjamin Netanyahu was absolutely historic. And it means that every country that is a signatory of the Treaty of Rome is now obliged to arrest the Israeli Prime Minister if he enters their territory. Now, as you'll know, the UK is one such member of that treaty. But this morning, our Home Secretary was reluctant to spell out what that actually implies.
The UK is a signatory of the International Criminal Court. So I just wanted to ask if you can confirm that he would be arrested if he came to the UK.
Well, that's not a matter for me as Home Secretary. The International Criminal Court is, of course, independent, and we respect its independence and the role that it has to play. But in the overwhelming majority of International Criminal Court investigations, they never become a matter for either the British legal and law enforcement processes or for the British government. In any case where they ever do, there are proper processes that need to be followed, and therefore it wouldn't be appropriate for me to comment on those. What I can say is that obviously the UK government's position remains that we believe the focus should be on getting a ceasefire in Gaza. We have seen obviously the huge troubles really right across the Middle East ever since the Hamas terrorist attack in October 7th last year, and our focus needs to continue to be on getting a ceasefire in place.
You say that it's not for you to answer the question about whether or not Benjamin Netanyahu would be arrested if he arrived in the UK, but the UK is a signatory of the International Criminal Court. Don't we have to respect its rulings?
As I said, we respect the independence of the International Criminal Court. That has long been our case, and we've always respected the importance of international law. But as I've said, in the majority of the cases that they pursue, they don't become part of the British legal process or the British government processes. On those cases where they do, there are important processes that need to be followed, and that's why it wouldn't be appropriate for me as the Home Secretary to comment on individual cases in a speculative way.
OK, so you don't want to say whether or not he would be arrested.
I mean, she didn't really want to say anything at all, right? It seems to me that it's actually quite clear, right? The Rome Statute says that if there is an arrest warrant from the ICC, then every member state has an obligation to carry out that arrest warrant. Now, she's saying, oh, well, it's very rare that this has been the case that the UK has had to do something about this, right? And that's true because there aren't many war criminals that will come to a member state of the Statute of Rome. But she's being asked a hypothetical question. Politicians don't like hypothetical questions so long as they don't want to give the answer. They're very happy to in any other situation. If you ask a politician, would Putin be arrested if he arrived in Britain? I'm sure they'd be very happy to say yes. Asked later in the day whether the UK government could confirm it would arrest Netanyahu if he were to come to Britain. A Downing Street spokesperson said they wouldn't get into hypotheticals. So this is what I was just saying there. They did say this, though. The UK will always comply with its legal obligations as set out by domestic law and indeed international law. So again, that doesn't really tell us much. It's a very mealy-mouthed response. And for a braver answer, we could look to the Irish Taoiseach.
If Benjamin Netanyahu were to land in Ireland, for whatever reason, would he be arrested?
Yes, absolutely. We support international courts and we apply their warrants.
That was a good answer, right? And it shouldn't be an answer that gets you a big round of applause, because that should be the very basic answer. If you're a member of the ICC and the ICC has an arrest warrant out against someone, then if they come to your country, you arrest them. It's not particularly complicated. Of course, though, there are governments that have responded even more poorly than the United Kingdom. Hungary is a signatory to the Treaty of Rome, so they are obliged to carry out the ICC's arrest warrants. But Prime Minister Viktor Orban responded to the ICC decision by inviting Netanyahu to Hungary and pledging that his country would not enforce the arrest warrant. Now, that may seem extreme, and it is extreme, but it's only in line with our own Conservative Party. Their Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick said this: the UK should not enforce this farcical arrest warrant from a politicised court. Really, really extreme that that's from the Leader of the Opposition. Not the Leader of the Opposition, sorry, the Shadow Justice Secretary, which means it's got approval from the Leader of the Opposition, right? Because the whole point of the Shadow Cabinet is that you have collective responsibility. To find out how we should be interpreting these responses to the ICC arrest warrant, I spoke earlier today to Tayeb Ali. He's head of international law at Byman's and director of the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. And I began by asking Tayeb what he makes of the response from the UK government.
Well, I mean, look, the UK government hasn't said that it's not going to arrest Netanyahu. But, what it hasn't also done is made its position crystal clear. I would want to say, if I was a government minister, that if there was a suspected war criminal coming into my jurisdiction and my country was a signatory to the Rome Statute of the ICC, or we even had domestic legislation, as we do have under the International Criminal Courts Act 2001, I'd want to make it clear that this is not a safe place for suspected war criminals. And people who are suspected of war crimes, as Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and Mohammed Daif are, and they entered into our jurisdiction, we would pursue them in accordance with the law, international law as well as British law, and ensure that they were subjected to a trial at the appropriate venue. And that's what the government ministers should do. And it's not difficult. It's not like they don't know the language, because they've said this about Russian suspected war criminals in very similar circumstances. And so it's kind of a bit odd that they seem to be fluffing about the words that they need to use when it's regards to Israeli suspected war criminals.
Anyone who's not a legal expert, I mean, listening to Yvette Cooper this morning, I suppose I was just a little bit confused, She made it all sound incredibly technical. She's saying that it's not my role as the Home Secretary to comment on whether Netanyahu would be arrested. What's she talking about? Why is it not her role?
It is her role. In fact, the International Criminal Courts Act 2001 makes it clear. It brings direct obligations on the Secretary of State to move, to enact and act on arrest warrants provided by the International Criminal Court. So what happens is, so why is she saying that? I don't know. Maybe she needs legal advice. Rather than sort of making a statement which is designed clearly to not embarrass the British government and to protect Netanyahu's frailty, if you like, in this situation. That's the reason she's making these remarks. But the situation is really simple. We have an International Criminal Court arrest warrant. If Benjamin Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant come into this jurisdiction, it's really straightforward. The Secretary of State, having received that arrest warrant, should send that to a judicial authority, a court. A court looks at the arrest warrant and makes sure that it is a real arrest warrant, which would be very basic and simple to do. And once they've decided or determined that, they execute that warrant and pass it to the police, and the police execute it. They go and arrest the individual and detain them, pending transfer to the International Criminal Court. That's the process. The International Criminal Court Act 2001 has provision in it for what to do in an emergency situation where there isn't even a warrant in the hand of the Secretary of State. At the direction of the International Criminal Court and a request from the ICC, the UK Secretary of State can ask a court to detain an individual pending service of an arrest warrant and can remand the individual in custody for that period of time. And you know, the International Criminal Court Act is one of the more simple acts to read. You can just read this and see. And I'm only talking about sections 1, 2, and 3 in the International Criminal Courts Act. It's really straightforward. It's not difficult.
Labour have been a bit mealy-mouthed, but as you say, they have said they will, comply with the International Criminal Court. They've just been a bit sort of, vague about what that really entails. There's been a very extreme response, though, from the opposition. So Robert Jenrick, who is the Shadow Justice Secretary, so a very significant figure in the Shadow Cabinet, and sort of when it comes to this issue, has said, quote, "The UK should not enforce this farcical arrest warrant from a politicised court." And I mean, presumably that would mean leaving the Treaty of Rome and leaving the International Criminal Court. And I suppose I want to know from you sort of how unprecedented is it to have someone from one of the two major parties saying, completely screw international law?
I mean, it's totally unprecedented. It's not appropriate. I mean, something to say about the opposition party in the recent leadership election. It's really interesting that they were trying to find a leader that could show themselves as being the baddest of them all. Not somebody good, but someone who could be the worst, that could attract popularity and support from their constituents. It's a really odd situation we're in. And this is just an extension of the fall of the Conservative Party. But there's also something else. I'll remind you that my organisation, the ICJP, has submitted an evidential-based complaint to Scotland Yard some months ago for 5 Tory ministers who were in government at the time for their part in alleged complicity in war crimes. And, it's not a surprise that it follows that if the Conservative Party or the United Kingdom uphold the arrest warrants for the ICC, it follows that those that have secondary liability, in the way our complaint suggests to Scotland Yard, secondary liability for war crimes should also be arrested, detained, and prosecuted for the precise crimes that the ICC have spoken about. Starvation as an example, crimes against humanity as another example, the complicity in those by supporting those. So it's not really a surprise that maybe members of the Conservative Party feel a little bit vulnerable for their own role in what they did whilst they were in government in supporting the very serious allegations of war crimes now currently based against Israel.
Viktor Orbán, the Prime Minister of Hungary, they are a signatory to the Treaty of Rome. He said he's inviting Netanyahu to come to their country and he won't arrest them in defiance of the ICC. I mean, presumably that would mean that Hungary would have to, again, leave the Treaty of Rome and leave the ICC. I also presume Netanyahu probably isn't going to want to test this. I suppose so. Can I get a comment from you both about Hungary, but also, I mean, Netanyahu presumably is going to play it safe and stay in Israel and not travel to any country that is a signatory of Rome. Is that sort of your understanding as well?
I think it presents a multiple level of problems for individuals. I mean, this decline and deterioration of international law and adherence of Western states in terms of their respect and even understanding of international law is really worrying. And if we lose the rule of law, we end up in a position where domestic laws are not respected, let alone international laws, and you end up with chaos. That's the reason why laws are there in the first place. They're meant to regulate the behaviors between individuals. So Hungary is destined to set a very dangerous precedent, but it's also a little bit dangerous for Orbán, because let me put it to you like this. If you are harboring war criminals, if you are supporting war criminals, if you are assisting war criminals, you might argue that that is also complicity in those war crimes. And domestic legislation is one thing. So Hungary might decide that, look, it's fine. Nobody in our police force, we can control them. They're not going to arrest anybody. That's not an issue. But that doesn't mean that the International Criminal Court won't look at those acts as criminal acts in their own right. I mean, if you take the position, for example, where a state decides to engage on a path of violation of international humanitarian law and creates a framework within its domestic legislation to protect the politicians within that country from any kind of accountability or prosecution within that state, that doesn't protect them from prosecution outside that state in any of the other signatory countries or at the ICC itself. It would be ridiculous to think it would, because then any state that was engaged in war crimes would simply make it lawful to do so. And so that it's an absurd situation. And I would imagine that there will be lawyers in Orban's own jurisdiction that will be looking to enact accountability procedures, including potentially arrest for people that harbored war criminals even in that jurisdiction. And certainly if Netanyahu came to the United Kingdom and was protected by our politicians, if they decided to give safe haven to a suspected war criminal, lawyers like myself would turn our legal guns on our own politicians, because we can't accept our politicians deciding what is right and what is wrong when the law is plain. You can't have a situation where COVID legislation results in our own politicians here being fined or being prosecuted for criminal acts. And when something as serious as war crimes is on the agenda, suddenly you can ignore it. It's an absolutely ridiculous situation that they would put us in.
As far as I understand, the majority of arrest warrants issued by the ICC haven't been enacted because, the person who has the arrest warrant against them just decides never to leave their country or never to visit a country that's a member of the Treaty of Rome. So I suppose from sort of historical examples, when have these ICC arrest warrants been enacted? Obviously, I don't want necessarily a comprehensive list, but in what kind of situations do ICC arrest warrants become enacted, and what kind of situation could we imagine Netanyahu or Gallant or Deif sort of being held to account and being arrested?
It's a question that you can answer by simply saying the International Criminal Court is an extremely busy place. There are a series of ongoing investigations. There have been a series of prosecutions to date, convictions also. But what's really interesting here is that when the prosecution is targeted at an African leader or somebody in that region, or against Putin, suddenly the ICC becomes, the bastion of international humanitarian law. But when it attacks an ally for similar, if not worse, crimes, suddenly it becomes a pariah situation. But, I'll say this to you. You're right that Netanyahu could quite well stay in Israel along with Gallant, but I don't think this is the end of this process. The war crimes are continuing in Gaza, in the West Bank, and even Lebanon now. And so I think that the ICC investigation is likely to be continuing. Evidence is still likely to be gathered. My own organization is still in the process of gathering significant evidence of war crimes with regards to that particular region. And what you'll see is this is just the beginning of the accountability process. You're seeing effectively the highest level politicians having arrest warrants being issued against them, but it will continue. The level of criminal activity or allegations will widen. The number of suspects will widen. And it'll work in concentric circles until there is accountability in that region for the very serious war crimes that we're seeing on our phones and on our TVs every day.
What implications could this arrest warrant have, even if Netanyahu is not arrested, if you see where I'm coming from here?
So you have an independent court that has made a decision based on evidence gathered and presented to it that there are reasonable grounds for very serious war crimes against the most serious crimes that are available to be prosecuted on our planet at the moment. Crimes against humanity for murder, starvation. These crimes were directed at a civilian population, and they were widespread and systematic by Israel. What that means is that any institution, any organization, any financial institution needs to think very carefully about supplying and continuing to provide information materials to Israel, because they could end up being complicit themselves. So the impact of this is wide. It's no longer a question as to whether there could be or is there enough evidence. The highest criminal court in the world has decided that there is sufficient evidence to formulate a prosecution for Israeli war crimes. That has massive implications for the supplying of weapons, the supplying of financial services, the supplying of support for anybody in that region that might also be committing those crimes. But also, let's just look at the United Kingdom. The 5 ministers from the Tory government that we have a complaint against, well, let's think about how difficult it now would be for the British police, Scotland Yard, that are looking at that evidence and looking at those complaints to just dismiss it. It would almost be a ridiculous situation that a police officer in the United Kingdom would look at evidence and say, well, actually, I've come to a different conclusion with regards to this evidence, as to what really senior judges in the International Criminal Court have done. And you might say that will end. It makes it an inevitability that eventually those ministers will be held accountable. That's certainly the promise that we made at my organization, that we weren't going to let politicians have their term in office, commit war crimes, and then go off and have a regular life like everybody else does. They're going to carry that and liability and the need for accountability with them for the rest of their lives. These are really serious things. People died. We can't just ignore that.
That was Tayyab Ali from the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians speaking to me earlier today. Kieran, I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, there was a moment today when sort of The Guardian had this big sort of flash headline saying, UK says it would comply with the ICC ruling. And sort of when I read it, or it said it would arrest him kind of thing. And it doesn't seem like their message has changed all day long, which is they would comply with it, which I suppose means they would arrest him because that is the law. It's quite simple. But they don't want to say it. And I suppose my question to you, does it matter? So if they've said they would comply with the ICC ruling, which means that they would arrest Netanyahu were he to come here, does it matter that they won't say it outright in a similar way to which the Irish Taoiseach did, for example?
Well, I mean, it's evidence if more were needed, and I think we saw it in the word salad presented by the Home Secretary in that clip you played earlier, that the UK government has been dragged kicking and screaming to this fairly mealy-mouthed declaration. And they've been dragged kicking and screaming, not just because they ideologically oppose it. In fact, probably not because they ideologically oppose it principally, but because they are, in their short time in government already, complicit in what has been going on by refusing to ban the sales, new licenses and the sales of weaponry and equipment and so on to the IDF and to the Israeli government, and by giving coverage through rhetoric. I mean, it was only last week that Keir Starmer, proudly and boisterously declared in Parliament that because he's a human rights lawyer, he knows that this is not genocide. Well, I struggle to believe that Keir Starmer blushes about very much, but I do think a lot of them are going to be very, very concerned. I completely agree with Tayyab Ali about the secondary liabilities point that he makes. It's a legalistic term, but essentially, what it means is that other people will be made liable for this as well. People lower down the pecking order. And I think that, the sooner that happens, the better. One of the best outcomes of all of this will not be necessarily, I mean, your question, Tayyab Ali, will Gallant actually be arrested? Is very much an open question. And I think, I don't know, it's possible. Maybe it's not probable. But what this does is it acts as a giant cautionary mechanism now, in which Western politicians, international arms dealers, people trading in the Israeli economy, supplying goods, services, and equipment specifically for the IDF, will be scratching their heads and thinking, excuse my language, but shit, are we next? Or now that a new standard has been set, a new precedent has been set, if we continue to engage in this, we will become complicit, or there's a very good chance that we become complicit. That raises the stakes all round. And by raising the stakes, I think, you see a greater, what we hope, a greater caution in engaging in that kind of relationship with Israel going forward. And I think also, I just want to say there's one danger here as well. Yesterday's news was miraculously unexpected, very, very welcome, extremely positive, and very significant. But there is one danger, and it's a danger that can be solved through the secondary liabilities thing that Mr. Ali mentioned. I'll explain it. If Netanyahu and Gallant are exceptionalized, if a clique or an elite within the Israeli establishment says, let's cut our losses and sacrifice them, then it could very well be that Netanyahu and Gallant stand trial, but everybody else who is complicit for this is vindicated on the basis that they've handed over at some juncture in the future the two people actually wanted by the ICC at this moment in time. We need to avoid that. This needs to create, as we say, secondary liabilities further down the food chain. And I think, it would be a very good outcome if IDF soldiers who have been copiously documenting their own war crimes were chased by the rule of law and forced to stay within Israel themselves going forward.
It seems unlikely to me that sort of an arrest will happen, at least in the near term. I mean, there could be sort of a radical change in international politics sort of at some point in time. It doesn't seem like a likely prospect to me, but I've just sort of got up on my laptop a picture of David Lammy shaking Netanyahu's hand, and that's just from July this year. So one of the sort of the first things Labour do when they get into government is the foreign secretary goes off and sort of proudly meets with Netanyahu. And I do wonder if presumably that's not going to be possible now that there is an ICC arrest warrant against Netanyahu. And I suppose that is also what's somewhat remarkable about this, which is the critique of the ICC has often been that it only prosecutes what principally was African leaders for a very long time, then Putin. And it's potentially unheard of for it to have an arrest warrant out against an ally of the West, which will put, governments like our own in a difficult position. What they're going to do. I can't imagine David Lammy posing for a photo with Netanyahu. Now there is this arrest warrant out, but I also wouldn't put it past him. Keir Starmer is having a hard time on social media today after posting this last night. So he tweeted, "I'm determined to deliver growth, create wealth and put more money in people's pockets. This can only be achieved by working in partnership with leading businesses like BlackRock to capitalise on the UK's position as a world-leading hub for investment." And you can see there Reeves and Starmer, and then there's a picture of Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock. And you might notice this has been viewed 11 million times. Now, that's a lot of views for a tweet about a meeting that he's had with a business leader. I'll explain, though, why this seems to have gone so viral. Some background: BlackRock is the world's largest asset management firm. It controls $11 trillion, yes, you heard that right, $11 trillion worth of assets. The traditional role of an asset manager has been to manage the money in pension funds, investing them in the stock market and bond markets to get a stable return for their customers. So people, you want your pension fund to sort of increase in value over time. The asset managers manage that pot of money. These companies, though, have become more controversial since they began buying up physical infrastructure. That includes American renewable energy companies, wastewater services in France, and airports in England and Australia. This has made asset management companies controversial with the left, so to whom they're seen as privatizers in chief. But curiously, it was actually right-wingers who have been giving Keir Starmer the hardest time for his meeting with BlackRock's CEO, Larry Fink. Carl Benjamin is a far-right YouTuber who said this: "He's actually proud to be selling us out to BlackRock. Unreal." And that's got 29,000 likes, so clearly struck somewhat of a chord. The Reform MP for Great Yarmouth, Rupert Lowe, replied to the original picture with this, sorry. "You're an embarrassment, Prime Minister." Again, 34,000 likes. And Dominic Cummings said this: "Dear Labour MPs, did you go into politics to watch a Labour Prime Minister try to flog the country on the cheap to BlackRock while cutting winter fuel payments to pensioners George Osborne style?" So why does this meeting seem to be particularly annoying to the right? Of course, the right generally aren't too fussed about privatisation. Well, partly it's because the timing of the meeting fits well into a theory which has become popular among farmers protesting changes to inheritance taxes, or at least the sort of right-wing elements in those protests. Now, some of them believe the reason Labour has closed tax loopholes is so small farms are sold to international capitalists like BlackRock, and also, the theory goes, like Bill Gates. Now, George Galloway tweeted this on November the 17th, so 4 days before Starmer's meeting with Fink. "Do you want our farms owned by the agribusiness, people like Bill Gates, or companies like BlackRock, or by independent farmers like Jamie Blackett, who puts the case for independence?" Jamie Blackett, someone there he's interviewing. So he's saying the threat here is that these farms get sold to Bill Gates or BlackRock. When The Guardian attended the demonstration this week on Whitehall with the farmers, they also heard people complain about Bill Gates.
Show number 10, show Keir Starmer, show Bill Gates, who's had some weird interest in the farming industry as of late.
It's a bit concerning. I kind of probably see maybe the bigger picture of where this may well be heading. We're seeing it all over the world, big names such as Bill Gates taking over large swathes of farmland in places like America, China, etc. Before we know it, we'll be eating lab-grown meat and maybe eating the bugs.
A tomato doesn't taste like a tomato anymore.
So we've heard these sort of theories before. Lots of decisions made by government are down to Bill Gates wanting control of X, Y, Z. Well, after Starmer's meeting with Think Aaron Banks, he was the biggest single donor to the Brexit campaign, also made the connection with BlackRock. So he said BlackRock will buy all the farmland and pay no inheritance tax or any tax for that matter. So he's saying, this was also BlackRock can buy that farmland. And then obviously the fact that people had this theory or publicising this theory, and then Keir Starmer tweets this image with BlackRock, that does seem a bit stupid at best. So what is going on here? What really is the nature of BlackRock? Should Keir Starmer be meeting with them? And is there really a conspiracy to push small farmers off their land so their land can be bought up by the likes of Bill Gates and BlackRock? Well, earlier today, I caught up with Brett Christophers. Brett is the author of the book Our Lives in Their Portfolios, Why Asset Managers Own the World. And I began by asking Brett what he makes of Larry Fink's visit to Downing Street.
It's predictable, I guess, would be the first word that comes to mind. I mean, Labour's made no... it's no secret that Labour's been, talking for months, both prior to the election and since the election, about kind of cozying up to asset managers, not least when it comes to questions of investment in Britain going forward, specifically, I think, investment in infrastructure. So it's a sign of the times, I guess, as much as anything else. And I think entirely predictable. I mean, there are lots of concerns one might have that we can talk about, but I think predictable is the first word that comes to mind.
What are those concerns? Because I imagine what the Labour Party would say is, look, we're desperate for investment in the UK. We've sort of set our whole pitch as we are the ones who can encourage international investment to flood into Britain to bring about economic growth. You might say it makes sense to the guys who are sitting on the biggest pot of cash because that's how you bring investment into the country. You aren't so sure about that. I mean, could you talk about both sides here?
I mean, the first of all is that it's kind of funny, almost in an ironic kind of way, that Labour are talking about BlackRock in terms of investment in new, what would essentially, one would hope, be new activities, new assets, new industries, and so on. Because that kind of ignores what BlackRock is, which is an asset manager which invests almost exclusively, at present at any rate, in through its big index funds. It invests in existing shares and bonds. Historically, at least, it has not been one of the asset managers that invests in building new assets, new infrastructure, new housing, anything like that. There are lots of other asset managers that do that, one of which is Blackstone. So maybe Starmer actually got a bit confused and mixed up BlackRock with Blackstone. But BlackRock historically hasn't done that. It's only just now moving in that direction because last month it bought another asset manager, a big asset manager called Global Infrastructure Partners, which does do that. It's, I think, the world's third largest asset manager in terms of investment in infrastructure. So maybe it's going to do more of that now. But historically, at least, BlackRock hasn't even done that. So that's the first thing to say. The second concern that I would have, and this is much more of a concern, would be that the likes of BlackRock only undertake this investment if it's on very, very favorable terms. They have lots of different investment opportunities available to them, and they kind of scan the world looking for what the best options are. And they obviously pick off those where they're being offered a juicy deal. And so if the UK wants BlackRock to be investing in the UK's future, BlackRock's going to take its pound of flesh for doing that. There's a very good counterpart story to this that came to mind today when I was reading about this, which was that just over a year ago, I think about a year and a half ago, I happened to be in New Zealand, and there was great excitement because the day I was there, BlackRock and the New Zealand government had announced a landmark new deal where they were setting up a new fund together. BlackRock was setting up a new fund to invest specifically in New Zealand and specifically in New Zealand climate infrastructures, things like renewables. And there was great excitement, exactly the same as Starmer is hoping to generate in the UK context, which is like BlackRock believes in our national future and is going to invest in our future. And I was asked at the time, what do you make of this? And I said the same thing. I was like, well, they'll do it if it means they can make a lot of money. And people were like, oh, okay, we hadn't really thought of that. And then a year and a half later, I looked today, and as far as I can tell, BlackRock has made no investments in New Zealand. And I'm not even sure if it's been able to raise money for that fund. So it might happen, but it'll only happen if BlackRock thinks it can generate reliable, predictable, and pretty much guaranteed returns of above the hurdle rate that it requires to invest. That's the second thing. And then third and finally, I think the reality is that if you look at the history of investment by asset managers, not necessarily specifically BlackRock, but other asset managers that do invest in infrastructure and housing and the like, it's a pretty depressing history where, on the one hand, it's been a pretty negative experience for those who are the users of those infrastructures or the tenants in the housing, if it happens to be housing. And then at the same time, it's been a pretty dismal experience in terms of the amount of investment in the upkeep and maintenance and so on of those assets at the same time. And so the classic story in the UK context would be Thames Water. So everyone knows what a basket case Thames Water is today. And almost all of its really severe problems emerged in the period between 2006 and 2016, when its majority owner was an asset manager, Macquarie. It was then that the problems really emerged in terms of rapidly increasing rates, but rapidly declining amounts of new investment in the infrastructure. And the argument I would make and have made when I've written about this is that that is exactly what you would expect with the type of business model that asset managers pursue. They are almost always, by their very nature, short-termist investors that invest in infrastructure predominantly through fund vehicles that are fixed in life, that they know are going to be wound up after a certain period of time, typically 10 years at a maximum. And so when they invest in these infrastructures, or to take the Starmer example, when they invest in Britain, they're not doing it with a view to kind of perpetuity. They're doing it knowing that they not just can, but have to sell out within a certain amount of time to return the capital to the investors who gave them that capital to invest in the first place. So when it comes to questions like investment in maintaining infrastructure, repairing leaks, so on and so forth, there is an inherent propensity to prefer short-term sticking plaster type solutions rather than actually undertaking the investment that is required. Because as long as they think that they can sell when time comes at a reasonable price, they have no inherent incentive to undertake repairs and so on, the benefits of which will accrue 15, 20 years down the line, because they know they're not going to be around anymore. So those, I know I went on a little bit, but those would be my three main thoughts about why we should be concerned about this type of announcement.
And let's talk about the specific reaction to Keir Starmer's meeting with Larry Fink on Twitter, because obviously you're from the left and you're critical of BlackRock. There's also many theories on the right as to why this was very problematic. And in particular, there are lots of people suggesting that the reason the Labour Party closed a tax loophole on farmers was so that they would then sell up and companies like BlackRock would be able to swoop in and buy that farmland. Now, I want to know, from your perspective, is that theory at all plausible?
So that strikes me as being a classic case of a kind of absurd conspiracy theory. I think if nothing else, that requires belief in a level of kind of calculative ingenuity on behalf of the politicians involved that is probably more than we should allow for. So I don't see any kind of concrete degree of kind of credibility in that argument at all. Strikes me as nonsensical. I don't think the two things are connected at all. I mean, I could be wrong, but I think it's very unlikely.
Is the issue there a coordination problem, that the idea that Rachel Reeves thought, I'm going to increase inheritance tax or close inheritance tax loopholes so that BlackRock can come in and buy this land? Is it sort of, that seems far-fetched? But could it be the case that even if it wasn't pre-planned, when small farmers sell up their land, if they have to, that companies like BlackRock might come in and buy that farmland? Is that, even if we take the conspiracy out of it, so it's more accidental, could it be the case that BlackRock benefit from this?
Absolutely. So one of the so-called classes of so-called real assets that asset managers have become very, very substantially invested in over the last 2 or 3 decades is farmland. It hasn't happened in the UK. Although historically pension funds have been relatively significant investors in the UK farmland. But it certainly happened in Australia, it's happened in the US, it's happened to a massive extent in South America. Not so much BlackRock, but the likes of Macquarie and Brookfield and others, Brookfield Asset Management, which is run these days, not coincidentally, by the ex-head of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. They are big investors in farmland. So absolutely, it's entirely possible that they could come in and be significant buyers of that farmland. But having said that, I'm not entirely convinced that the UK government would prefer them as owners of farmland than UK small farmers. I'm not entirely convinced that there would be a preference within the UK government to have UK farmland owned more by international asset managers than UK small farmers. I don't see an argument for that. So yes, it could happen, and to some extent, it probably will happen. But I just don't see that there's any argument for kind of deliberative design there on the part of the government.
And at this point, I want to show you a clip from a video from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., which has been reshared today or yesterday, sort of over the last couple of days, in reference to this meeting about a slightly different theme, the war in Ukraine.
Mitch McConnell was asked, can we really afford to spend $113 billion to Ukraine? He said, don't worry. It's not really going to Ukraine.
It's going to American defense manufacturers.
So he just admitted it's a money laundering scheme. And who do you think owns every one of those companies? BlackRock. So Tim Scott, during the Republican debate, said, don't worry. It's not a gift to Ukraine. It's a loan. So raise your hand if you think that loan's ever getting paid back. Yeah, of course it's not. So why do they call it a loan? Because if they call it a loan, they can impose loan conditions. And what are the loan conditions that we impose on? Number one, an extreme austerity program, so that if you're poor in Ukraine, you're going to be poor forever. Number two, most important, Ukraine has to put all of its government-owned assets up for sale to multinational corporations, including all of its agricultural land, the biggest single asset in Europe. In Ukraine, there's been 1,000 years of war fought over that land. It's the richest farmland in the world. It's the breadbasket of Europe. 500,000 kids almost, Ukrainians, have died to keep that land as part of Ukraine. They almost certainly didn't know about this loan condition. They've already sold 30% of it. The buyers were DuPont, Cargill, and Monsanto. Who do you think owns all of those companies? Yeah, BlackRock. And then in December, President Biden gave out the contract to rebuild Ukraine. And who do you think got that contract? BlackRock.
Brett, what do you make of that sort of claim from RFK that it could be BlackRock driving American foreign policy in Ukraine? Does that strike you as plausible?
It strikes me as maybe somewhat more plausible than the UK based conspiracy theory, which, as I see it, that we just talked about in terms of farmland. I mean, I think it's well known that major asset managers in general and BlackRock in particular has the ear of American government in a way that it, at least historically, it hasn't had the ear of the British government. And it's clearly the case that lots of American policy in the last decade or so has been shaped quite actively by BlackRock and internally by people working within the federal administration that are ex-BlackRock people. So there's an influence there. What I would say though is that, I don't, at least to my knowledge, that has not been predominantly or at all in relation to foreign policy. It's been in relation to, domestic infrastructure investment, climate policy, housing policy, those sorts of things. But it's not entirely far-fetched that there's an influence there on foreign policy. My guess, and it is only a guess, is that influence would be relatively marginal. But insofar as it's true that major US corporations have influenced US foreign policy in relation to, for example, the Middle East and natural resources there, why wouldn't it be possible that they also shape American foreign policy in relation to Ukraine and assets like farmland there? It's definitely possible, but I think, to my mind, somewhat unlikely.
A related question, because RFK Jr. has just been nominated to Trump's cabinet. Whether or not he, gets confirmed in the position is a separate question. But it does seem like it's an interesting situation where someone like you from the left, you've been sort of warning people about BlackRock for a very long time, and now you have potentially an awkward set of allies in the White House surrounding Donald Trump. I mean, what do you make of that?
I don't give it much thought, to be honest, because I think that there are plenty of issues around where you can get lots and lots of different parties in terms of their political complexion having similarly negative or alternatively similarly positive perspectives on a particular issue. And I think that asset management involvement in the economy is and particularly in relation to assets that play an important role in people's lives, like housing and infrastructure, is one of them. And so it doesn't necessarily surprise me. I think if you look at, for example, the role of private equity asset managers in buying up a lot of housing, single family and multifamily housing in the US over the last couple of decades or so, that's another issue where, again, you've had a lot of criticism from the political left, Elizabeth Warren and left of her, but also from the political right, for whom I suspect it's a somewhat more opportunistic tactic. That kind of critique of crony capitalism, for want of a better term, is something that does play well sometimes on the political right as well as the political left. I think it's important to think about what the particular concerns are that are being articulated. Just because two sets of commentators are critical of something, it doesn't mean that the specific concerns they articulate are the same in each case.
That was Brett Christopher speaking to me earlier today. And if you want to hear more about Brett's book on asset management, you can check out the downstream he did with Aaron Bastani last year called The Plan is to Privatise Everything. That link is in the description below. John Prescott, Deputy Prime Minister from 1997 to 2007, died this week, aged 86. Prescott had a background rare for Labour MPs today. From a working class background, Prescott failed the 11 plus and cut his political teeth as a trade unionist and cruise liner steward. As to his legacy, there are conflicting views. Some see him as a charismatic pragmatist who helped Labour back to electability and power. Others see him as a foil for Tony Blair, giving him the working class cover he needed to take the party to the right. Wherever you stand on the man's legacy, though, one thing that's been apparent in the clips people have been sharing this week is that he was an incredibly impressive communicator. In a deputy leaders debate ahead of the 1997 election, he delivered this masterful evisceration of Michael Heseltine.
Why is it always millionaires like yourself get uptight about £2 an hour for people on minimum wage? Why do you always have to do that? I'll tell you.
I'll tell you. because I know something about actually creating jobs as opposed to just talking about it.
You've obviously done a lot better than your workers have.
Yeah, but in fact created a large number of jobs in the process.
Not at £2 an hour.
Not at £2 an hour.
No.
The fact is that if you put
millions of our people live on £2 an hour.
When you made your original statement on these issues, you admitted there would be loss of jobs if we introduced minimum wages. Your own words. Now, you just tell the people in this country...
Is £2 an hour acceptable to you?
You know perfectly well that what you're talking about is £4.08 an hour as the minimum wage.
Is £2 an hour acceptable to you as a very wealthy man?
It is nothing to do with me being a wealthy man.
Well,
what you're trying
is it acceptable £2 an hour?
It is entirely a matter of what people are prepared to accept in the circumstances of getting a job. And the fact...
Very, very effectively put. And the minimum wage is, of course, one of New Labour's legacies, which is undeniably a good thing. There's lots of pros, there's lots of cons to their 13 years in office. The minimum wage, unambiguously a good thing, argued for very impressively there by John Prescott before they entered power in 1997. Now, the other viral clip of Prescott this week has been his appearance on Top Gear with Jeremy Clarkson in 2011.
They used to be able to drive into London on 3 lanes. You made it 2. You put a speed camera up. You made it 50. That was daft.
And it meant, no, that the flow of the traffic was better because people aren't rushing to the 2-lane from 3. And I've heard motorists get, and I hear them all cheering here, but don't you get annoyed when somebody wants to push in? Actually, when you've done your 3 and your 2. How many people get annoyed at that? When they come down to 3 and they come down to 2. Come on, put your hands up. You know they are. They are. And they get bloody well
Sit down. Sit down. It goes... Right.
Hey, they're cheering for me, not you. All right, fair enough.
I mean, strangely, there's actually some similarities to Jeremy Clarkson this week when he was asked by the BBC about his comments about inheritance tax in the past. And then he sort of turns to the crowd of farmers saying, are you with me? Are you worried about getting charged inheritance tax and having to sell up your farm? So maybe he learned that from him. Kieran, well, I suppose we'll go on to the man's legacy sort of more generally in a moment. First of all, though, especially that second video there, lots of people were sharing that saying, there is no one on the Labour front bench who would be able to do that now. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I do think it's fair. I mean, I think, nostalgia is a false elixir. And every generation thinks that its politicians are the worst generation of politicians since the last ones. It's almost an iron law of British parliamentary politics. But it seems to be undeniable that of the current complexion of the front bench of the Labour Party, there's nobody who can communicate as well as that. There's nobody who's as charismatic as that. And those are qualities that the left, I think, often finds vulgar and doesn't feel that comfortable discussing and thinks unserious. But I personally think it's lamentable that all of the charismatic populists seem to be produced by the right these days. And I do think that it plays a role, marginal, behind other things like power and interests and policy and so on. But it does play a role in the failure to produce, credible left-wing governments through the ballot box. I think that John Prescott, actually, I should have said in my last response to you, Michael, part of the reason we're not getting those kinds of politicians now on the front bench of the Labour Party is because the sort of umbilical cord connection between unions and the Labour Party is, of course, lost in the way that it existed in the past. And I think generally speaking, John Prescott was somebody who was very comfortable being pragmatic. We see that, I say pragmatic actually consciously in a slightly derogatory way. He was somebody who was comfortable going along with the war in Iraq and so long as he had his super department. Now, but at the same time, I think John Prescott genuinely was, he self-styled as a street fighting union man, socialist. I think he genuinely was a sort of union-based socialist who got into parliamentary politics, obviously was very, very skilled at, holding his nose is a generous way of putting it, perhaps, holding his nose while, Blair and Brown did some of the things that a union-based socialist might find less agreeable under other circumstances. But he used that power that he was given very shrewdly. And he did give, undoubtedly Blair was also a very skilled political operator and knew that Prescott would function very well optically and, substantively in relation to a privately educated individual, Brown, and the others around him. And so, it was all very calculated and conscious. Nonetheless, I think we have to give John Prescott his dues. He, after the war in Iraq, and after he left government, he said he regretted it for the rest of his life. He went one further, which is certainly forms a break or a rupture with the rest of the new Labour milieu. He openly and publicly and repeatedly said that the war in Iraq was illegal. That was his judgment. He was good on Palestine. He was consistently good on Palestine, although one check against his name on Palestine is that he was also very naive about Bush Jr.'s roadmap to a two-state solution in the early noughties. Again, his honest self-appraisal after he left power, he acknowledged that. He acknowledged that he'd been too naive about that, but was consistently pro-Palestinian and actually very withering, called Gaza a concentration camp as far back as 2014, said things that very few people who had sort of scaled the dizzy heights that he had within New Labour and within the British establishment would openly say. So I think, look, it's a mixed ledger. And many on the left will say he was very, very good at defending Corbyn, and he was. And that's where his kind of pyrotechnic, charismatic communication skills, I think really did a solid to the left at a time when Corbyn was in very low water and had very few allies from the among the so-called big beasts of recent British political past.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly no coincidence that he came out of the trade union movement, because the one person I can think, I agree with you when it comes to the right. Like, I think Nigel Farage could do something like that. I mean, I think he probably has many times done something like that. On the left, the only person I can really think of now who could pull that off would be Mick Lynch, who's obviously the leader of a trade union. But I suppose with the decline of the industrial workforce, it makes sense that you get fewer of these people who are sort of incredibly charismatic coming out through the trade union movement, though I'm sure there are many more people that could be rising to be Labour MPs if they were allowed to, which brings us to a tweet from Michael Crick, the veteran political reporter. For all the nice words about John Prescott from Keir Starmer and other leading Labour figures today, he almost certainly wouldn't be allowed to be a Labour candidate these days as a left-wing troublemaking trade unionist. Michael Crick was, of course, the journalist who I think most effectively covered, let's say, some of the shenanigans when it came to Labour selections before the last general election. So he knows a lot about this. And I do think it is notable that if you think, there's so many new Labour MPs because they won a landslide after a pretty poor showing in 2019. And of those, can you think of anyone who sort of strikes you as a bit like John Prescott? Anyone who's sort of like a big working class fighter, charismatic, not necessarily someone who follows a script? I don't think anyone like that did get through, which is a shame, of course. Let's wrap up there. Thank you so much for watching this evening. Have a fantastic weekend, and we'll be back on Monday for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.